The Crusades were not merely a series of religious wars between Western Christianity and Eastern Islam. They were among the most prolonged and complex chapters in human history, stretching over nearly 2 centuries. When most people think of the Crusades, they imagine knights in white cloaks bearing red crosses, galloping through arid deserts on a holy quest to reclaim Jerusalem. But behind that cinematic image lies a tangled web of quiet suffering, sacrifice, and unexpected transformations in the very fabric of European society. It all began in the late 11th century, when Pope Urban II called upon Christians to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. His call wasn't just a sacred summons, it was a promise of salvation. Anyone who joined the crusade, rich or poor, peasant or noble, was assured that all their sins would be forgiven. For the poor, it was a rare chance to escape a life of hardship. For the nobility, it offered opportunities for land and prestige. And for the Church, it was a powerful moment to assert its divine authority across Europe. The First Crusade began in 1096. It was chaotic from the start. Thousands of peasants and devout followers formed massive columns, marching eastward with blind faith that they were fulfilling God's will. They lacked proper weapons, tactics, and supplies. Many died from hunger, were massacred, or sold into slavery long before they reached the Holy Land. Then came the armies of nobles, equipped with cavalry, trained soldiers, and brightly colored banners. They fought not just for God, but for conquest, for treasure, for glory. In 1099, they captured Jerusalem, but what followed was not peace, but carnage. Muslims, Jews, and even some non-Catholic Christians were slaughtered. Yet this bloody triumph marked only the beginning of deeper consequences that would ripple through the centuries. After conquering Jerusalem, the Crusaders established new kingdoms in the east. The most notable of these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A new class of Western nobility found itself ruling over foreign lands in the heart of the Islamic world. To defend themselves, they built massive fortresses, some of which still stand today. These fortresses weren't just military structures. They were the physical expression of cultural collision. The Islamic world, fragmented at the time, eventually began to unify in response. Leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Saladin rose to power, bringing together disparate Muslim factions to resist the Crusader states. Saladin, in particular, became legendary, not only for his military brilliance but for his surprising mercy in an era of bloodshed. When he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, he did not seek vengeance. He allowed many Christians to leave or buy their freedom, sparing the city the horrors it had once endured. The Third Crusade, featuring figures like England's Richard the Lionheart, failed to retake Jerusalem. The crusading movement began to lose its power. Later crusades lacked focus. 1. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land at all. It instead sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, deepening the divide between Catholic and Orthodox branches of the Church. Yet even as military efforts faltered, the impact of the Crusades grew in unexpected ways. Europeans returning from the East brought back not only war stories but knowledge, goods, and a new awareness of the wider world. They learned architecture, mathematics, and medicine from the Islamic world. Perhaps more importantly, they began to see Europe as just one part of a much larger global tapestry. Trade routes opened. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa flourished through commerce with the East. These trade networks would eventually pave the way for explorers like Marco Polo, and much later, for the Age of Discovery. In a strange twist, the Crusades may have helped awaken Europe's curiosity, the first flicker of the Renaissance that would follow centuries later. But the legacy of the Crusades is not seen the same way by all. For many Muslims, they remain a memory of foreign invasion and violence. For Jews, they mark a time of brutal persecution, not only in the Middle East but also across Europe. For modern Christians, the Crusades represent a painful reminder of when faith was weaponized for conquest. Still, no matter the perspective, the Crusades carved a deep mark in history. Their cultural, political, and religious echoes lingered long after the battles ceased, and in the quiet of night, through distant chants and fading hoofbeats, the memory of those crusading days whispers on, reminding us of a time both glorious and grim. As the Crusades unfolded over the following decades, The world that emerged began to shift in ways that were both subtle and profound. After the First Crusade, several Crusader states were established across the Levant, including the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli. These small kingdoms were fragile, constantly under threat, and deeply dependent on reinforcements from Europe. To survive, they forged unlikely alliances, adopted foreign customs, and in some cases, lived in a delicate balance with their Muslim neighbors. Far from the image of unbending warriors of faith, many crusaders settled into the practical realities of governance, diplomacy, and trade. Back in Europe, the Crusades sparked immense change as well. While they were initially framed as spiritual journeys, they quickly turned into massive logistical undertakings. Organizing and funding a crusade required resources, ships, food, weapons, armor, horses, and men. Nobles often sold land, took loans, or pledged wealth to the church in order to join a campaign. This movement of wealth and people shifted economic power. Land ownership changed hands. Banking families, like the Medici in later centuries, found early opportunity in financing these expeditions, and the Italian port cities that provided ships and supplies, such as Venice and Genoa, began to grow rich on the profits of war and commerce. One of the more unexpected consequences of the Crusades was the rise of military religious orders. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights were warrior monks, men who took religious vows but fought in battle. They protected pilgrims and defended Christian lands in the East. But beyond their piety, they became highly organized, wealthy, and powerful institutions. The Templars, for instance, developed an early form of international banking, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land. Their fortified monasteries became centers of learning and administration, and their influence stretched from Jerusalem to Paris and London. Yet the more the crusading ideal expanded, the more it lost focus. The later Crusades were no longer about Jerusalem. They became political tools. In the Albigensian Crusade of the early 13th century, the Catholic Church turned its swords inward against the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France. Branded as heretics, the Cathars were slaughtered in a campaign of religious cleansing that had little to do with the Holy Land and everything to do with consolidating church authority. Crusading had become a license to wage war against anyone labeled an enemy of the faith. At the same time, the cultural exchanges that the Crusades enabled began to leave deeper marks. European crusaders encountered advanced cities in the Islamic world, places with libraries, hospitals, fountains, and gardens. They saw sciences that were centuries ahead of Europe's. Arabic numerals replaced Roman ones. Texts on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy were translated from Arabic into Latin. Works of ancient Greek thinkers, long lost to Western Europe, were rediscovered through the Islamic world's preservation. This intellectual cross-pollination planted seeds that would one day blossom into the Renaissance. There were also more mundane influences. Europeans developed a taste for Eastern goods, spices, sugar, silk, and glass. These luxuries became symbols of status. To satisfy the demand, trade routes strengthened, merchant families grew powerful, guilds emerged to regulate production and trade. Life in Europe slowly began to shift from feudal subsistence to the beginnings of a market economy. Though few realized it at the time, the Crusades were helping to lay the foundation for a commercial revolution. Yet it would be wrong to suggest that these changes brought peace or understanding. The Crusades hardened religious identities. They deepened the divide between Christian and Muslim worlds. They sharpened theological boundaries and intensified hatred. The rhetoric of the Crusades painted Islam as an existential threat, a view that persisted long after the last battle ended. Likewise, Muslims came to see Christians as aggressive invaders, fueled not by faith but by greed and arrogance. In Byzantium, the consequences were just as tragic. The Byzantine Empire, once a proud center of Orthodox Christianity, had initially invited the West to help fend off Turkish advances. But the relationship deteriorated. The Latin Crusaders looked down on the Orthodox Christians as schismatics. The Byzantines saw the Latins as barbaric and arrogant. The final blow came in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, when Crusaders diverted from their mission and sacked Constantinople. Churches were looted, relics were stolen, Even nuns and monks were not spared. The spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity was desecrated by fellow Christians. The divide between East and West would never fully heal. For ordinary people, the Crusades were often a time of terror. Entire villages in Europe were sometimes left without men as they marched off to war. In the Rhineland, Jewish communities faced massacres by mobs on their way to the east. Wrongly accused of deicide and seen as convenient scapegoats, the chaos and religious fervor allowed the worst in people to emerge. And for many innocent lives, the Crusades were not a holy mission but a nightmare. Despite all this, the idea of the crusade did not fade quickly. In fact, it became a kind of myth, reshaped and retold to serve different purposes. Monarchs used it to rally loyalty. The church used it to inspire obedience. In time, the word crusade itself became less about Jerusalem and more about any grand, righteous mission. Even centuries later, the echoes of that word would appear in literature, politics, and war. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the age of the Crusades drew to a close. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291. The dream of a Christian kingdom in the East had crumbled. Yet the world it helped create, the networks of trade, the rise of cities, the movement of ideas, continued to grow. And so, the Crusades left behind more than stone castles and battlefield legends. They left behind a Europe forever changed. A continent that had looked inward for centuries began, tentatively, to look outward. And though the dreams of conquest faded, the legacy of those dreams lingered, quiet, complex, and never fully resolved. As the embers of military crusading cooled, something quieter but no less significant began to unfold across the European continent. The Crusades had stirred a new kind of energy, an awakening that reached into every village, monastery, and royal court. With returning crusaders came not only tales of hardship and glory, but also strange words, spices, fabrics, and stories of cities far more advanced than anything found in Europe. Even the common folk, though far removed from politics or warfare, began to sense that the world beyond their fields was larger, more complicated, and somehow, vaguely, reachable. The knights who returned, those who survived the years abroad, found themselves changed. Some brought back wealth looted from cities like Antioch or Constantinople. Others brought back injuries that never healed, or faith that had been shaken by the violence committed in its name. A few even returned with foreign customs, clothing, or language habits absorbed during long stays in eastern cities. The home they returned to, however, had not stood still. In their absence, power had shifted, new alliances had formed, and perhaps most critically, their absence had revealed how thin the line was between order and chaos. Feudal lords who sold land to fund crusading journeys often came home to find their holdings reduced or under new ownership. In their place, a rising class of merchants and guild leaders had grown in prominence. The urban centers that supplied the crusading campaigns had grown richer, more organized, more central to European life. Venice, in particular, flourished. Its ships had carried thousands of crusaders to the east, and in return, they brought back silk, sugar, glass, and exotic knowledge. The city's docks buzzed with goods and gossip, and its palaces reflected the wealth won not through war, but through commerce. These shifts echoed far beyond economics. The intellectual current that had begun to flow into Europe carried ideas that had long been buried or forgotten in the West. Scholars in Islamic cities had preserved and expanded upon the works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy. With new translations came old questions. What was the nature of the universe? Could reason and faith coexist? In places like Toledo and Palermo, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars sometimes worked side by side, manuscripts were copied, debated, and slowly absorbed into the European canon. The Crusades, ironically, opened the door to a rebirth of classical thought. The universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, once focused almost entirely on theology, began to explore logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy. The seeds of modern science were being planted, not through discovery, but through recovery. And as scholars wrestled with Greek and Arabic texts, they also began to question the rigid structures of their own world. Was the church always right? Could knowledge come from outside scripture? These were dangerous questions, but they had been made possible, in part, by war. Cultural curiosity was not always matched by tolerance. Most crusaders had viewed the East through a lens of superiority, suspicion, or fear. To many, the Muslims were still infidels, their cities targets for conquest, their customs strange and threatening. But in quiet corners, especially among those who had lived in Eastern cities for years, a different view emerged. These men had broken bread with Muslim neighbors, negotiated truces, even fallen in love. Their stories, when shared back home, offered glimpses of a more nuanced reality. Even among clergy, a few voices rose to challenge the dominant narrative. Some argued that God's justice was not confined to one people or one faith. Others lamented the violence done in the name of Christ. A growing body of religious mystics and reformers began to shift focus from crusading zeal to personal devotion. They called for humility, for inner transformation, for compassion instead of conquest. Their influence would grow in the centuries to come, particularly during times of plague and upheaval. While these deeper currents moved beneath the surface, the visible symbols of the Crusades stood firm in the landscape. Castles with thick walls and high towers dotted the Mediterranean coast. In towns and cities, churches housed relics brought from the East, shards of the true cross, bones of saints, or supposed fragments of Christ's robe. Pilgrims came from far and wide to view these holy objects, reinforcing the idea that the Crusades, for all their bloodshed, had achieved something sacred. These relics often became central to local pride, shaping identity and community rituals for generations. Yet even relics had a shadow. The theft and trade of sacred objects stirred tensions between Christian regions. Who owned holiness? Could the sacred be bought, stolen, or sold? These questions played out not just in whispers, but in church councils, papal edicts, and the sermons of traveling friars. As the church tried to rein in corruption, it faced an uncomfortable truth. The Crusades had created not only martyrs, but merchants of faith, of war, and of power. The church itself had changed. Once a purely spiritual institution, it now held vast lands, armies, and influence over kings. The Pope, who once called knights to war, had become a geopolitical player, maneuvering in a world where salvation was currency. Some welcomed this, others saw it as betrayal. The very idea of a universal church began to fray at the edges, a tension that centuries later would explode into the Reformation. Meanwhile, the Islamic world had its own transformations. Though fragmented, it had withstood the Crusades. The unity briefly forged under Saladin had not lasted, but the memory of resisting foreign invasion endured. In poetry, in architecture, and in collective identity, the defense of Jerusalem became a rallying symbol. Mosques were rebuilt, scholars wrote chronicles, and just as Christians debated the meaning of their campaigns, Muslims too wrestled with the cost and consequence of holy war. For both worlds, the Crusades became stories to be told, lessons to be drawn, warnings to be heeded, and as the generations passed, these stories were shaped not just by truth, but by need. In some versions, they were tales of heroism. In others, cautionary epics of pride, cruelty, and loss. Always, they echoed the complexity of their time. And in quiet corners of monasteries, beneath flickering candlelight, monks wrote it all down, each detail, each name, each battle, not to glorify, not always to condemn, but to remember, because somewhere, even in the blood and dust, there was something worth remembering. A moment when the world cracked open, just a little, and two civilizations saw each other clearly, for better or worse. As the sun set on the final Crusader strongholds and the last banners were lowered from the castles of the Levant, the dream of a Christian kingdom in the East slowly faded into memory. The city of Acre, once a vibrant Crusader hub bustling with merchants, knights, and clergy, fell to the Mamluks in 1291. Its fall was not just the end of a military presence, but the symbolic closing of a chapter filled with fervor, blood, and ambition. With its collapse, Europe was forced to face an uncomfortable truth: the Holy Land was lost. And with it, the idea that faith alone could bend history to one's will. But even as swords were sheathed and pilgrimages replaced battles, the true legacy of the Crusades was only beginning to take root. Europe had changed. not through victory, but through the slow, often unnoticed accumulation of contact, trade, and contradiction. The people of the continent were no longer quite the same. They had seen the other side of the Mediterranean. They had walked through the streets of Damascus, Aleppo, Acre, and Jerusalem, and they had come home, carrying fragments of that world, tangible and invisible. In the centuries following the Crusades, European architecture reflected these encounters. The pointed arches, domes, and decorative stonework of Islamic cities found echoes in cathedrals and palaces from Paris to Prague. Even the very shape of a fortress evolved. European castle builders began to imitate the massive concentric walls they had seen in Syria and Palestine, building layered defenses that bore the mark of Eastern innovation. The Gothic style, often seen as a pinnacle of European design, carried within it subtle traces of the East. Language absorbed foreign terms, especially in the spheres of medicine, science, and navigation. Arabic words filtered into Latin and then into vernacular tongues. Algebra, alcohol, zero, all entered European usage through translations of Arabic texts, many of which had themselves preserved earlier Greek works. It was a linguistic chain that stretched across centuries and continents, linking Plato to Avicenna to Thomas Aquinas. Meanwhile, economic patterns began to shift in ways that no general or pope could have predicted. The demand for Eastern goods, spices, silks, precious metals, only grew. Italian merchant cities expanded their reach, not with fleets of warships, but with caravans and galleys. Trade flourished along the routes that had once carried crusader armies. Venice and Genoa, once supply points for knights and horses, became centers of banking, shipping, and diplomacy. They brokered deals with Muslim rulers, negotiated safe passage through hostile territories, and learned to navigate the currents of politics as deftly as any battlefield. Out of this commercial awakening emerged a new kind of European, one driven not by feudal loyalty or religious piety, but by opportunity. The merchant, the banker, the urban entrepreneur. These figures would come to dominate the late Middle Ages and help propel Europe into the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. And they owed part of their rise to the doors opened, however violently, by the Crusades. But this transformation came at a spiritual cost. For many, the failure of the Crusades created a sense of disillusionment. The Holy Land had not been won. The infidels had not been defeated. Instead, Christians had fought Christians, cities had been burned, and the church itself had become entangled in corruption and power struggles. The memory of the Crusades became uncomfortable, something that inspired less pride than reflection. In art and literature, this shift was visible. Early Crusade chronicles had been filled with triumphal language, divine missions, holy victory, the glory of martyrdom. But later works grew darker, more introspective. Poets wrote of lost causes, painters depicted weary nights, and theologians began to ask whether violence could truly serve God's will. The notion of just war, once confidently asserted, became a subject of debate. Meanwhile, the crusading impulse found new, more insidious outlets. The Reconquista in Spain, the centuries-long effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, borrowed heavily from Crusade ideology. Spanish kings were granted indulgences by the Pope, and their wars framed as holy struggles. The same would later apply to the conquest of the New World, where explorers carried not only flags and swords, but also crosses. The idea of bringing salvation through domination, born during the Crusades, was repackaged and exported to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This rebranding of conquest as sacred duty allowed empires to expand under the banner of righteousness. But the violence and exploitation that followed were not so easily cloaked. Native populations suffered, cultures were destroyed, and once again, faith became a tool for power, echoing the logic of those first knights who had marched toward Jerusalem with both prayer and ambition in their hearts. In the Islamic world, the legacy of the Crusades took a different shape. Though victory had ultimately favored Muslim forces, the wars had exposed vulnerabilities. New dynasties rose, like the Mamluks in Egypt and the Ottomans in Anatolia, shaped in part by the need to resist foreign threats. The memory of the Crusades persisted in Islamic literature as a warning of the dangers of division, of the cost of complacency. And as the centuries wore on, the term crusader became less historical and more symbolic. A word evoking invasion, arrogance, and religious hostility. Despite the layers of memory, pain, and myth, one thing remained true. The Crusades had left scars on both East and West. Scars that could not be healed with peace treaties or rebuilt with stone. They existed in stories, in architecture, in the quiet suspicion between cultures. They lingered in prayers and prejudices alike. And yet, within the complexity of this legacy, there were also moments of beauty, of coexistence, of individuals who crossed boundaries, linguistic, religious, cultural, to learn, to trade, to live. In the cities of the Levant, there were markets where Christians, Muslims, and Jews did business side by side. There were medical schools that treated all who came, regardless of creed. There were marriages, friendships, conversations, brief flashes of humanity in the midst of conflict. These moments did not erase the violence, but they offered a different kind of legacy, one not of conquest, but of connection, fragile, fleeting, and often forgotten, yet real. They remind us that even in an age defined by division, bridges were still built, quietly, one word, one gesture, one shared meal at a time. And as the world slowly turned its gaze to new frontiers, toward the Atlantic, toward the unknown, those bridges, too, would matter, for the past had not vanished. It had only changed its shape. It lived on in memory, in map, and in myth, and long after the banners were lowered, the Crusades continued, in hearts, in histories, and in the dreams of those who came after. Long after the last Crusader fortress had fallen and the echoes of swords on stone had faded into silence. The legacy of the Crusades lived on, not just in monuments or manuscripts, but in the way the world came to understand itself. The Crusades, though rooted in the medieval world, cast a shadow that stretched across centuries, shaping how civilizations viewed one another, how they justified war, how they imagined the boundaries between the sacred and the worldly. And in that shadow, countless new paths were carved, some noble, many tragic, all undeniably human. In Europe, the Crusades became a chapter of memory, told and retold by generations who had never set foot near the Holy Land. Kings claimed the title of Crusader for wars that had nothing to do with Jerusalem. Monarchs adorned their courts with symbols of distant battles to legitimize their rule. Writers and artists reimagined the knights of the Crusades not as conquerors but as pious heroes. Chivalrous and just, the truth, messy, painful, and deeply human, was often buried beneath layers of myth. By the time of the Renaissance, Europe had moved on in many ways. New questions gripped the imagination: the structure of the universe, the dignity of man, the potential of science. Yet the spirit of the Crusades remained, transformed, redirected. Exploration became the new pilgrimage, colonization the new conquest. Faith still marched alongside ambition, not always behind it. When European ships crossed the Atlantic or rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they did so not only for trade, but also with the language of divine purpose. The same phrases used to justify wars in the Levant were now used to sanctify empire. This legacy shaped the modern world. Ideas of civilizing missions, of bringing truth to the unbeliever, of reclaiming sacred lands, these were not born in the 19th century. They had roots in the Crusades, and as colonial powers grew, they carried with them the same contradictions, a hunger for dominance cloaked in the language of virtue. These patterns, of violence, of righteousness, of misunderstanding, would repeat themselves again and again, reshaped to fit each era. In the Islamic world, the Crusades became a memory of resistance, not merely of war, but of endurance, while the medieval period saw the Islamic response framed in military terms. Later centuries transformed it into a narrative of unity against aggression. In the 20th and 21st centuries, political leaders and movements would invoke the memory of the Crusades, framing Western actions in the Middle East as a continuation of ancient hostility. The word Crusader was no longer historical, it became symbolic, a label that carried centuries of pain. Yet there was another legacy, one quieter but no less enduring, a legacy of exchange. The Crusades brought Europe into prolonged contact with the Muslim world, and in that contact, despite violence and mistrust, knowledge passed from hand to hand. The works of Aristotle and Galen, the mathematical genius of Al-Khwarizmi, the astronomical charts of Persian scholars. These treasures made their way into European universities and monasteries. Translations were copied, ideas debated. Without this exchange, the intellectual awakening that followed might never have come. Even more subtle were the ways in which the Crusades changed identity itself. What did it mean to be Christian, or Muslim, or European, or Arab? These questions were shaped by centuries of conflict and coexistence. The boundaries that hardened during the Crusades continued to define global politics long after the last night fell. Nationalism, religious exclusivity, even the very map of the modern Middle East, all bear traces of those earlier confrontations. In art and architecture, echoes linger still. Cathedrals inspired by Eastern design, calligraphy influenced by Latin scripts, music and instruments that crossed cultural lines. Food, too, tells the story. Sugar, cinnamon, and citrus fruits that became staples of European cuisine arrived through Crusade-era trade. Even the fork, once considered strange in the West, found its place at European tables after Eastern contact. Small things, yes, but reminders that culture often travels where armies do, and outlasts them. In our own time, the Crusades are often misunderstood. Some see them as proof of religious extremism, others, as early symbols of Western resolve. Both views miss the point. The Crusades were not simply wars. They were a mirror, one that reflected the hopes and fears of an entire age. In them we see courage and cruelty, idealism and ignorance, faith and fanaticism walking side by side. They remind us how easily belief can be twisted, how quickly noble intentions can lead to tragedy. But they also show the complexity of human contact. Even in the worst of times, people learned from one another. They traded, wrote, translated, and sometimes, even if rarely, loved across battle lines. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Crusades. Not the battles or the borders, not the castles or the relics, but the contradictions, the way the human spirit can be both violent and curious, dogmatic and open, tribal and global. The Crusades were not the end of an age. They were the beginning of a long, difficult conversation between cultures that still continues. And now, as we look back through the centuries, through dust and memory and myth, we see more than just knights and kings. We see a world becoming aware of itself. A world beginning to ask, who are we? Who are they? What do we owe each other? And can understanding grow where once there was only war? In that quiet, just before sleep, when the stories settle and the past feels close, the Crusades whisper still, not to glorify, not to condemn, but to remind us that history never truly ends. It only waits to be remembered.